everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm super excited to share with all of you my thoughts about the new Pat McGrath mini eyeshadow palette in the color story Midnight Voyage. So I don't have the palette with me here. I'm actually filming this video before the release of the palette, but I do have 5 of the 6 shades from my existing Pat McGrath collection, and I'm pretty sure I can find some dupes for the final shade as well from my existing eyeshadow collection. And so in this video, I'll be giving you guys swatches of all these shades, demoing them on my lids in a few different looks, and sharing with you my thoughts and impressions about this release. So if you're interested in hearing more about this new eyeshadow palette, then just stick around. So before we dive into the swatches, let's just chat about my initial thoughts about this release. So I was very caught off guard when this release happened. So basically it was leaked by Trend Mood 1. So I actually haven't seen any news about this from Pat McGrath's own Instagram, at least as of the filming of this video. This palette is exclusive to Sephora, so that might be one reason that Pat McGrath hasn't done much advertising herself. But this is a pretty unique release for her. For just $30, you can get 6 of her shades in this plastic packaging, which looks very different from her other packaging. When I first saw the leak, I had to take a double take because it didn't look like Pat McGrath. So at first I was like, wait, did I just read Pat McGrath on that packaging? And I had to really inspect the image to make sure I wasn't just seeing things. But indeed, this is a Pat McGrath release. It's not in her typical black lacquer packaging. It's also not in her cardboard packaging or in some of the clear plastic packaging that she used in the past for these sort of mini eyeshadow releases. If you guys have been following her sales on her website for a while, you've seen that she has sort of phased out her previous mini eyeshadow palettes, which were in this more plasticky clear packaging. So I feel like this release is replacing that sort of mini eyeshadow palette. Overall, it seems like a pretty good deal price-wise if you're someone who has never tried Pat McGrath palettes. So for context, her recent Bridgerton eyeshadow palettes, which also only have 6 eyeshadows, are $65 each. And also previously, when she did these sorts of 6-pan eyeshadow releases, like this guy over here, which is Golden Opulence, these were in cardboard packaging with 6 shades and also were in the $65 range. One thing to note though is that this palette does not have any Blitz Astral shades, which her Bridgerton palettes do. So it's more similar to these previous releases she had, where it's 6 shades that have 1 Skin Show shade, 2 matte shades, and 3 metallic shades. Of course, I am anticipating this palette will be way smaller than these prior releases. This one, for example, has 12 grams of product, and based on the Sephora website, it's a little bit confusing in terms of how big this palette is. If you look at the image that has a picture of the packaging itself, it comes in her gold foil pouches, which are generally pretty small. Those are usually only around this big. And on that pouch, it says 3 grams of product, which would make it a quarter of the size of this palette in terms of amount of product. It would also mean that it's around half to a third of the size of VIII Petit Pro palettes. So you can see here the amount of product you get for these. These do have 8 shades though, so per shade it might be more similar. Now the area where things do get a little bit confusing is if you look at the description on Sephora, it says 6 times 0.1 ounces or 3 grams. And so that would make the total amount 0.6 ounces or 18 grams, which is far more than either of these palettes. So I highly doubt that that's correct because again, this is a previous full-size release from Pat McGrath. So I think we can expect that the amount that's on the packaging itself is correct and it'll be more in the 3 gram category. Now, I have a lot of other thoughts about the value of this palette based on the particular shades and the quality of those shades. So I'll run through that as I talk through the swatches and demo the shades on my eyes. So without further ado, let's get into these swatches. So if you are a Pat McGrath connoisseur and you have a bunch of her Mothership palettes, there's a decent chance that you have some of these shades already. So these are the 3 palettes that she drew from for this palette. In particular, we first have Bronze Seduction. and 3 of the 6 shades come from this palette. And this is one of, if not the most popular palette from Pat McGrath. It's the original Mothership that won an Allure Best of Beauty award. So there's a good chance you already have this palette and thus already have a good number of these shades. The shades are Skin Show Glow over here, which is the highlighter shade. So this is a beautiful inner corner or brow bone highlight if you like to have a little bit of a yellowish glow. Next we have Entrapment, which is the lighter matte shade in this palette. This is what you will typically use as a transition shade if you have this palette. And then we have Extreme Aubergine, which is the deepest shade in this palette, and it's a blackened plum. I will say these are not my favorite mattes from Pat McGrath. So as I'll explain in the demo, there are certain things that I have to do whenever I use these shades to get them to perform on my lids, which are typically steps I don't need to take with my other Pat McGrath mattes. So I did want to mention that if you pick up this mini and you find that the mattes are a little bit tricky to work with, it doesn't mean that Pat McGrath mattes don't work well for you. It's just that this palette happens to be the one Mothership that I find a little bit more finicky to use in terms of the mattes. So next up we have a shade from Subversive. So this is Night Creature, which I think is one of the most beautiful metallic shades from Pat McGrath's eyeshadows. So I am really excited that this shade is in this palette. As you can see, it's a beautifully creamy, highly dimensional shade. You really get a lot of shine and sparkle with this, and it's a very beautiful multi-dimensional sparkle. Finally, we have Divine Rose 2, and here we have Eleganza, which is one of my overall favorite shades from Pat McGrath. So I was also extremely excited to see this in this palette. As you can see, this is a gorgeous, cool-toned mauve rose shade with a touch of bronze taupe in it. And this just adds the perfect amount of light to any look that you have. Both of these shades are gorgeous all over the eyelid. So the one new shade in this palette is called Bronze Venus, and it's this coppery reddish bronze shade. And if you know Pat McGrath Mothership palettes, you know that she loves her bronzes. So basically every single Pat McGrath Mothership has at least one bronze shade. So for example, in Divine Rose 2, we have this bronze over here, and we have this one over here. This one struck me as being potentially somewhat similar, maybe a little bit more on the orangey side in comparison to Bronze Venus. Also in Bronze Seduction, we have this other bronze shade, which is more of your kind of classic coppery bronze. Moving over to Mothership 2 Sublime, we have this shade over here, which is a little bit more of a satin shimmer, so a little bit more peachy. And we also have this golden shade over here, which is much more dimensional, but also has that beautiful golden bronze. In her Celestial Divinity Holiday palette, we have this shade here, which is just named simply Bronze, and it's also in the same sort of color story. And then we also have Corruption, which is a little bit deeper and has more of a shift to it. So that one kind of shifts almost to a magenta fuchsia shade. And then from her latest holiday collection, we have Corrupt Copper. And I'm running out of room, so let me put that over here. I feel like that's actually a pretty promising shade. It has a little bit more reddishness than these other guys over here. And then finally, I also brought out my bronze palette from Natasha Denona, since I figured we might find some similarities here. So I think Gloaming and maybe High Degree and perhaps True Copper would be the most similar. So I'll put that on the back of my hand. So here is Gloaming. So this has more of a reddish flip to it. High Degree is much more red to begin with. And then True Copper has a little bit more of that yellowy copperness to it. But I feel like True Copper actually looks really similar to the pictures of Bronze Venus. So I would say I definitely, in my existing collection, have plenty of shadows that probably on the lids would look pretty similar to Bronze Venus. Based on the pictures, I think the closest comparisons I have are this shade from the Celestial Odyssey Holiday Collection palette, and then this True Copper shade from the Natasha Denona Bronze palette. So before I wash these off, let me give you guys a close-up of all these swatches. So here we have Skin Show Divine Glow, Entrapment from Bronze Seduction, Extreme Aubergine from Bronze Seduction, Night Creature from Subversive, and Eleganza from Divine Rose 2. And to keep everything in the Pat McGrath family, I think I'm going to use this copper shade from the Celestial Odyssey palette as a replacement for Bronze Venus in today's look. So I went off camera to do the rest of my face, and as always, if you're curious what I have on my face, just check out the description box down below where I have all the products linked. Basically today I have a full face of Pat McGrath on. So now let's get into the eyeshadow portion. So first off, as I mentioned earlier, I have a little bit of trouble working with these matte shades from Bronze Seduction. So when it comes with Entrapment, if you have a skin tone similar to mine or any lighter, this might be a little bit on the deep side to use as a transition shade. And so I have some tips and tricks on how to make this shade work. And then also this shade over here, Extreme Aubergine, is a little bit finicky to work with. It's a bit drier and patchier than most of Pat McGrath's mattes. So you do also have to be a little bit careful working with this one. And I would say that's true regardless of your skin tone. This shade, in my experience at least, is a lot trickier to work out than even her black matte shades. There's just something about this formulation that's a little bit more patchy on the skin. So for me, I actually did not really like using these mattes in Bronze Seduction until I watched a video by Mel Thompson talking about how to use Pat McGrath mattes. So I would highly recommend checking out her video if you're interested in more tips and tricks on how to make these highly pigmented mattes blend out. What I found to work really well is to either go in first with a concealer. So here I have the Pat McGrath concealer, and just take a little bit of that to use as your primer on your lid. If you're someone who tends to struggle with blending out highly pigmented mattes in your crease, try using concealer as a primer because it often is easier to use than primers that might be a lot more grippy. So this is a really great option, and I'll showcase this on this eye. The other option is to go in with a primer like the ABH eye primer, which is not that sticky. So this primer is very liquid in nature, as you can see here. And a little bit really goes a long way. So you can just put a very thin layer of this on your eyelid. And what I like about this primer is, unlike the Urban Decay, Too Faced, or Hourglass primers that I also use, this one doesn't really have a lot of stick to it. And so it's not hard at all to blend out pigmented mattes on top of it. And even though it's very white, as you can see, if you shear it out enough and you have a skin tone similar to mine, it'll still look relatively natural. So after you have either your primer or your concealer down, the next trick that I learned from Mel is to go in with setting powder. So I have here my Pat McGrath Under Eye Setting Powder, and with my Hinoki brush, I'm just going to take a little bit of this and just put some of this on the outer portion of my eyes. So I'm not going to set the center of my lids because I still do want a little bit of stick there. But just taking the tiniest bit of powder, I'm going to go around the outer corners. And this trick really has helped me a lot with highly pigmented mattes because it just makes it a lot easier to diffuse them out in the crease area. And also, if you do still apply the mattes and find that they're sticking, going in with a little bit of setting powder to blend them out on the edges can really help. So with the prep steps out of the way, let's get into the eyeshadow. So normally when it comes to a transition shade, I use a large fluffy blending brush like this Wayne Goss number 16. I find that this sort of brush gives me a nice, very diffused layer of color across the lids using windshield wiper motions. When it comes to using a shade like Entrapment though, which is on the much deeper side for my skin tone, I like going in with a smaller brush. So this is the Classic Crease from Sonia G. And I just tap a little bit in there, and then I tap off the excess product. And then I start with concentrating the pigment near the outer corner. And then I use some slight circular motions to blend the pigment upwards and outwards. And again, these were all techniques that I learned from Mel Thompson. And I find this very helpful for this sort of highly pigmented shadow that might otherwise be really hard to blend out. And the reason a smaller brush is useful for this kind of application is it'll just give you a little bit more control, since you want to actually shear out the shadow, so you will need to have a little bit more ability to buff it out. So you can see, using that sort of technique, I am able to actually get the shadow to look pretty light in the crease, which is my general preference for a transition shade. And the reason I mention all of this is that I personally have struggled a lot with the bronze Seduction palette from Pat McGrath. It was the first Pat McGrath palette I ever purchased, and I actually had such a hard time with it that I ended up returning it and basically not really thinking that Pat McGrath shadows were for me. Fortunately, I tried out some of her other eyeshadow palettes and found that they were much more easy to work with. And then I fell in love with Pat McGrath palettes, bought all of her eyeshadows basically, and also returned to her Bronze Seduction palette eventually. And I'm glad that with Mel's tips and tricks, I've been able to make this palette actually work quite well for me, and I've been loving the looks I've been getting out of it. But this isn't necessarily the most user-friendly palette for beginners, and given that probably a lot of folks who buy this mini eyeshadow palette will be folks who want to try Pat McGrath for the first time, I think it's just helpful to know about these tips and tricks. Alright, there we go. So as you can see, with that sort of technique, you can actually get a really nice, subtle transition shade out of this. So now for today's look, I'm actually going to do a series of looks just to show you guys what kind of use you can get out of this palette. So I'm going to start out with a super subtle everyday look. So we first just have that subtle brown all over the crease. And now I'm just going to go in to this Skin Show shade using this builder brush from Sonia G. And I'm just going to sweep this lightly all over the rest of the lid area, just to show you guys what kind of very simple everyday look you could get if you wanted to use this as sort of a travel palette and just take it with you in your purse. So there we go, just a very nice subtle hint of shimmer on the lids. And then for the lower lash line, I'm just going to dip back into Entrapment, sweep it all over the outer portion of my eyes. And there you go. So if you want a very subtle everyday look, you can definitely get it with this palette just by using those two shades and by very carefully blending the Entrapment shade in your crease area. Of course, if you have a deeper skin tone, you might not have to be as careful with that shade, but hopefully these tips help in case you pick up the palette and have some trouble with the blending. So now if you want to darken up this look a little bit, you can go in with a small brush. I have here my Rephr number 3 brush, into the Extreme Aubergine shade, and just work this along the lash line. I'm actually going to switch to Esom W12 brush, and you can use this smoky aubergine shade as liner. So this is a great technique if you want a little bit more definition, but still want things to overall be pretty natural. Especially if you have brown eyes, these sorts of smoky aubergine shades can really bring out some of the warmth of your eyes. And then I'm also going to take a tiny bit of that on the outer corner of the lower lash line as well. So here we have the second look, which is especially good if you don't want to go in with liquid liner. Of course, you can make this wing much more defined and precise if you use a different brush and if you build it up. But for a very simple, everyday smudged out look, this is a great option. So with these everyday looks done, let's get into the glam looks. So first off, I'm going to go back into this Entrapment shade, but this time I am going to use that Wayne Goss number 16 brush because I do want to actually pack more of a punch in terms of the pigment. So I'm just gonna sweep that all over the lid on both sides. And so you can see that definitely added a lot more depth. And I'm actually going to do 2 different looks on my eyes today just to show you guys some of the versatility with this palette. So on this side, I'm gonna keep things a lot more bronzy. And then on this side, I'm gonna make it a little bit more purple and violet, since I think that's basically the 2 directions you can go in with this palette. So cleaning off that brush a bit, now I'm gonna go into Extreme Aubergine on this violet side and really add some more of that purple depth. Again, with this particular shade, Extreme Aubergine, I do think you need to be a little bit careful with your technique in terms of building it up. I really love this shade, but I also find it one of the hardest to work with from Pat McGrath's mattes. So just build it up very slowly in thin layers. So already I think you can see that the 2 eye looks are taking quite different directions. This left eye is definitely going to be very smoky. So now I'm going to go into Subversive and pick up Night Creature. And I'm going to put this all over the outer half of the purple look. I really love this shade, and you could definitely have a beautiful look just putting this all over the lid. But I do want to also showcase Eleganza on this side. And then cleaning off that finger, I'm going into Eleganza and putting this on the inner half. And again, I absolutely love this shade. It is so pretty. One of my all-time favorite Pat McGrath shades. So there we go. I think you could see those 2 shades work very nicely together. So just to clean everything up, I'm going to go in with a small Wayne Goss number 19 brush into Extreme Aubergine, and then use this to just zhuzh out any edges while also adding a little bit more of that purple shade. Then I'm going to mimic that on the lower lash line, going in with my builder brush into Eleganza and putting that on the inner third of the lower lash line. And then going in with a bit of Night Creature and putting that on the center. And Night Creature is a little bit flaky, so you do want to be a little bit careful to avoid fallout. And cleaning that off, I'm going to grab a bit more of Extreme Aubergine just for that outer corner area to really deepen things up. And there we go. So this is the purple glam look. Really, really pretty. Very, very much loving this look. So the other side is going to be a little bit simpler, a little bit more soft glam. So I'm going to go into this copper shade that I'm using as a substitute for Bronze Venus. And I'm going to just put this all over the lid, pulling it upwards a little bit. And then I'm also going to take a little bit of Eleganza for the inner corner, just because I want to see how these 2 interact. I've never put Eleganza with such a warm shade. And then I'm going back with my Sonia G Classic Crease into Entrapment and just adding a little bit more of that brown to the outer portions of this look. Then for the lower lash line, I'm going into the copper shade again and sweeping that on the inner 2/3. Cleaning that off, going back into Entrapment and deepening up that outer third. As you can see, Entrapment can actually get pretty deep if you build it up. And now to finish off both looks, I'm going in with some of that Skin Show Glow shade and using that for inner corner highlight on both sides. And then a little bit of brow bone highlight as well. So here we have the 2 looks. Again, here is the purple side. And here we have the bronzy side. So I went off camera and did my eyeliner. Please ignore how crazy the wings looked. It was one of those classic cases of trying a new eyeliner technique and things kind of getting out of hand and then trying to make things match. So yeah, the wings are definitely a lot bigger and a lot more wonky than I would typically make them. But I think at least the eyeshadow still look quite nice. So to finish off this look, I'm just going to go in with some of my Pat McGrath Divine blushes and also highlighters. I do have some of the blush on already, but I just want to deepen it up a little bit now that I have my eye look on. So first off, I'm going to take my Hinoki brush and go in with some Divine Rose on the side that is the purple look, since I really love this shade for cooler tone looks. And then on the bronzy side, I'm going to go in with Desert Orchid from Pat McGrath. This is my go-to for more neutral bronzy looks. And by the way, I did pick up 2 of her latest release, the blush duos that she came out with, so definitely stay tuned for a video on those. I picked up the duo that has the lavender blush and also the one that's more terracotta bronzy. So I'm really excited about those. I absolutely love her Divine Blush formula. I have most of the blushes in her collection, so I'm really excited to try out these new shades. For the highlighter, I have 2 different shades of her Divine Glow highlighter. So I have Venus Nectar, which I'm gonna put on the side. Whoa, that was a little bit much. So I'm gonna put this on this side with the purple look, but definitely went a little bit heavy-handed there. So I am a little bit confused with her latest release, whether the Divine Glow highlighters are actually a different formula than her previous Divine Glow highlighters, or if she just released some new shades. Because this shade, Venus Nectar, is also a shade in her latest release, which she has described as a new formula, but it's the same name, like Venus Nectar Divine Glow Highlight, so I'm not really sure what's going on there. And then the other Divine Glow highlighter I have is her Golden Nectar one, which sounds very similar to the golden one in her recent release as well. So I didn't actually pick up any of the highlighters in this release because the only 2 I was interested in shade-wise was the 2 in the middle, which was the golden one and the Venus Nectar one. But I feel like they're probably going to be very similar to these 2 that I already have. So I don't know, I'm gonna see how the reviews are when they come in and whether the formula is actually different. But in case you're curious what the existing formula looks like, this is Golden Nectar and this is Venus Nectar. Venus Nectar is a little bit more peachy in undertone, whereas Golden Nectar has a pretty strong gold champagne flip. So here we have the final look. What do you guys think? So now for my overall thoughts and impressions about this new release. So on the whole, I think this is a really nice curation of colors. I really like that you can do a very everyday friendly look if you just use Entrapment and the Divine Glow shade, but that you can also have a variety of different types of glam looks. So you can have one that's a bit more warm toned, like this bronzy one over here, but you can also have one that's more cool toned. Also, the palette does feature some of my favorite shades, specifically Eleganza and Night Creature. As I mentioned, it doesn't really feature my favorite mattes. I do hope that Pat McGrath comes out with more of these sorts of curations, because I would say if I had to pick a single matte in her entire collection that's the trickiest for me to work with, it would be Extreme Aubergine. And as you could see, I was still able to make it work really well, and I still like the shade, so I will preface this by saying I love Pat McGrath. I own almost all of her eyeshadows, and I think they're excellent quality. But in terms of showcasing Pat McGrath to someone who is brand new to Pat McGrath, I would say that a lot of her other mattes are much easier to work with. The shimmers and metallics in this palette, though, are really easy to work with. Of course, I haven't tried Bronze Venus, but if it's anything like her other coppery bronzes, I think it'll be a really solid formulation as well. So on the whole, I think this is a great palette to either get some first exposure to Pat McGrath eyeshadows at a relatively affordable price, or to bring along as a travel palette if you don't want to bring one of your bigger Pat McGrath palettes when you're traveling. Of course, in terms of value, if you already know you like Pat McGrath, I would say probably per ounce or per gram, one of her larger palettes might be a slightly better deal, especially when you factor in the packaging and the full experience. Really, for Pat McGrath, if you want the full experience, you should try her Blitz Astral formulas. But in terms of just a very initial entry point that can deliver really beautiful looks, I am excited about this direction with these new mini palettes. For me, I probably will not pick up this palette just because I have 5 of the 6 shades already, and there are other palettes that I enjoy traveling with. But if she continues making these curations, hopefully there's some with some more new shades that I would like to pick up and bring along with me on trips. So that's it for today's video. If you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!